Hello and welcome to the video course on middle game mastery. I am Grandmaster Kuljasevic, and in this course I will try to explain how to approach the study of central pawn structures. This is a very important topic for middle game, which is closely interconnected with the opening as well. And it is very important for anyone because it doesn't matter which openings you play or which kinds of positions you prefer. Sooner or later, some very well-known structures, pawn structures, will appear in the center, and it's important to understand them, how to put your pawns, how to arrange your pieces, in order to get the best possible middle game. And the central pawn structures, just to clarify, are those that arise on these central squares. So in a broad sense, the center involves everything around D and E files, but generally we accept that central squares are D4, E4, D5, and E5. So for instance, here we have a position from the Ruy Lopez, where after the move D4, all sorts of central pawn structures are possible. So there could be an exchange on D4 when we would get here, after this exchange, we would get pawn on E4 against pawn on D6. There are some other possibilities. For example, there could be an exchange on E5. Then we get a different type of pawn structure with different set of rules and strategies. We could get a Benoni pawn structure like this, which is also completely different, and so on. So the key in this course will be to get acquainted with as many pawn structures as possible, and to understand how to successfully play in these pawn structures, to understand what are the evaluation criteria, what are the typical plans for both sides, and so on. So before we make a sort of a classification of different pawn structures in the center, I would like to just mention several reasons why it's important to study central pawn structures seriously. Definitely the first reason is, as I already mentioned, formation of plans. And these plans can be not only like in the opening or early middle game, but they can extend to middle game and even end game. So the reason is most middle game plans anyway revolve around the central pawn structure, and if you come to the game without really knowing or studying, let's say, an isolated queen's pawn very well, you might have some wrong notions about it, and it's like going into, especially if you're playing against a more experienced player, it's like going into a battle with a slingshot. It's not enough. You need to have a very solid knowledge about these well-known pawn structures. And this knowledge helps you navigate the complex positions correctly, not to make big strategic mistakes. The second reason why it's important is that you are saving time. So when you're playing a game, you definitely know how important it is to have enough time for the rest of the game. And it is a very bad sign if you find yourself often spending like 20 or 30 minutes in a fairly simple position, the one where you don't really have to calculate forced lines, but we're just trying to come up with a plan, and you're not sure what it should be. So studying these typical pawn structures helps you to sometimes play your moves on autopilot. You don't have to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. The third reason is just enriching your chess culture. So if you study more of these pawn structures, you will learn how to navigate more different types of pawn structures successfully. And maybe you have something in your opening repertoire, but your opponent takes you out of your comfort zone and he gets you into a pawn structure that you haven't studied before. That can be a problem. So it's very useful to study as many as possible. And in this course, we will basically, I think, cover all of the possible pawn structures. I think I counted around 30 major ones. And if you just get acquainted with all of them, you will get at least a general idea what to do in most of the positions that could arise on the board. And I want to make a case in point. For example, I know a lot of people who, as white, just to make things simple, they like to play this system, which became very popular lately, the London system. Now, this system is basically designed to avoid any central tension. So, once black attacks your center, you play c3. And the idea is to keep the center as solid as possible and focus on the piece play, which very often revolves around the e5 square, and then white sometimes puts his bishop on d3 to attack the king side, or he plays bishop e5 to get better control over e5 square, and so on. And while this is a very decent system for white, in the long run, playing only this doesn't help you really understand chess better, I think, because the real study comes with the study of central pawn structures. And here you have very few where you have to study seriously. On the other hand, you have a system like the Ruy-Lopez. Or at least if we start with these two first moves, white has several other options besides bishop b5 in the Ruy-Lopez. He can play d4, like the Scotch game, or he can play c3, preparing d4, but then black will counter with his own central plan with d5. So the practice has shown that instead of putting your piece, let's say, in the center, white can actually play several preparatory moves before he tries to build a pawn center with c3 and d4. And for that purpose, bishop b5 is probably the best move. It's putting immediately pressure on e5 pawn. And so you can see in this starting moves, black is doing the same. So everything revolves around these central pawns, as you can see. Now he can take this when we get the open Spanish after these first moves. When we also get an interesting central pawn structure, or he can play bishop e7, the closed Ruy-Lopez, when, as I said, everything revolves around these central pawns. When white has forced black to create this weakness with the move b5. And now finally white is ready to build the pawn center. So before he pushes d4, because here bishop g4 again indirectly puts the pressure on white's center, he prepares this with h3. Okay, now black has many moves, but let's say he plays the Chigorin variation. Okay, then we reach this position that we had in the introduction, where all sorts of central pawn structures are possible. And not without reason, one strong player, I don't remember who, said that if you learn the Ruy-Lopez, if you play the Ruy-Lopez, you learn chess. Basically, you learn everything about pawn structures that you need to know. Because you can get the closed center, you can get an open center, and all sorts of other centers that we will talk about in a short while. So now I want to move on to the classification of different central pawn structures. And this classification is based on one famous chess player's system. This is Grandmaster Alexander Kotov. In his book, Think Like a Grandmaster, he made a short classification, which I really like, of different central pawn structures. So, for simplicity's sake, I think we can use this theory. And let's start with, so there are five of these categories of pawn centers. Let's start with the open center. So, the open center happens, I'll just give one example, of course. Anything is possible to get there, but let's give a simple example here how the open center can arise. For example, this is a variation from the Queen's Gambit accepted. This is the open center. Basically, there are no pawns on these central squares. And what is characteristic of this type of central pawn structure is that piece play prevails. So it's very important how active your pieces are, if you can take the initiative with your pieces, if your opponent has some weak squares or weak pawns that you can attack, and so on. The second type of pawn center, it is a direct opposite of open center. It is the closed center. So very often we see closed center in the games or in the positions like those from the King's Indian defense. So this is just one example. So the center is completely closed for pieces. We often have a pawn wedge, either white or black, has a slight spatial advantage because of it. But generally the play moves on to the flanks. So one side will try to attack on the side where it is better, and the other side will probably attack on the other flank. In the King's Indian defense, it's usually black who tries to attack on the king side, white who tries to attack on the queen side. Then we have the third type of pawn structure. It is the so-called fixed center. It is sounds a little bit like closed center, but it is not. Let's see one example from the Nimzo-Indian defense. This is how we get the fixed center after these opening moves. So black puts the pawn in the center, and this is what we call the fixed center. Basically, these pawns are immobile, and the center is not really closed. It's just that it's fixed. So both sides will try to arrange their play around these central squares, like e5 and c5, or e4 and c4, or maybe try to attack these pawns in the center. So there is a whole set of different rules for this type of pawn center compared to open or closed center. The next one that we have is the moving center. So that's the center that has not been defined quite yet. There are still some pawn moves possible. We have an example here in the Queen's Gambit declined with the move knight e2. This was Botvinnik's favorite when he would play the move f3. And we get this kind of pawn structure from many different openings, like the Nimzo-Indian defense, where white is trying to push e4, and black can often counter it with the move c5. So the play now revolves around these pawn breaks, basically. So it's a very, very dynamic kind of pawn structure. And the last, according to Kotov, the last type of center is the flexible center. The flexible center is the one where the pawn structure has not been defined yet. So one very typical example is the Tarrasch defense, where you see that there is a strong pawn tension in the center. And what usually happens is that these pawns get exchanged, and then we get one of these other types of pawn centers. So I'll just give you some examples. Here, it's a completely symmetrical position, but white to move, he can now create the kind of pawn structure he likes. For instance, if he takes now on d5, we get the isolated queen's pawn type of pawn structure. This is somewhat of a fixed. Later I will explain, I like to call this a semi-fixed pawn center. The other possibility is if white takes on c6, we get the so-called hanging pawns. This is a type of mobile pawn center, because both sides can push their pawns. Black can push c5 and d4, or c5 and c4. White can push e4, maybe b4. So it's, again, it's a dynamic type of pawn center. On the other hand, here in the starting position, white can also opt for the open center. For instance, if black now just copies, he can take. These are all like opening variations. This is quite common. So we get the open center, similar to the Queen's Gambit accepted that we saw earlier. The other possibility for white here is if black takes like this and plays bishop e7, white can create a fixed center, which we mentioned earlier, or he can play c5, which is another type of center. It's a semi-fixed structure because it's possible for black to play e5 if he prepares it well, which again has completely different set of rules. So our goal in the upcoming chapters will be to explain these rules, explain some guidelines how to play these positions, and we will use some instructive examples of strong players. So this is, I think, quite a robust and broad definition of pawn structures, that central pawn structures, that helps us digest the complexity of this topic, because it's really so many of these pawn structures that you need some sort of simpler theory, something to help you understand the pawn structure when you see one. And so just to explain a little bit about the semi-fixed pawn structures, this is one of them. So this could be like our sixth type of pawn structure. In theory, these structures are mobile because the pawns can move, but in practice they're often fixed. These pawns don't move for a long time or ever. So, like if black never pushes e5, or if white never creates any other type of pawn structure in the center, then it's basically a fixed pawn structure. So they have like some rules for both fixed and mobile pawn structures. Okay, now I want to see the next example, where I want to explain one idea about the pawn structures, which is quite practical. And I've noticed this quite often, that people, even strong players, they understand the central pawn structures quite well in theory. They understand their good and bad sides in a static sense. But very often there are some dynamic factors that are slightly different from what we have learned in theory. So there are two parts to understanding pawn structures. There are static parts. So what are the typical plans, where the pieces should be, and so on. And there are dynamic parts, which are specific for every position. Here I have one example of a game that I played recently against an international master, Rade. And I was playing white pieces. This is a Carlsbad pawn structure, which we will talk about later. You can see the long pawn chains. So what would you say? Which kind of pawn structure is this? Is it open center, closed center, fixed, mobile, or dynamic? Or semi-fixed? So in my view, it's a semi-fixed pawn structure, because both white and black have some moves in the center. And here, my opponent probably thought this is a fixed pawn structure because he just wanted to maneuver a little bit. And I played the move that looks also like a maneuvering move, knight f3, at least to defend the king side. But actually I had something else in mind. I noticed some dynamic factors in this position. First of all, there is the rook on a7, which is quite misplaced if the position opens up. Secondly, there is this queen and bishop, and the geometry of queen and bishop. So if I would play e4, then if my knight gets to e4, there is sort of a double attack. And also the king on g7. So if the position opens up and the f6 square becomes weak, I can also try to attack the king. So there are several dynamic factors that my opponent probably forgot about. He continued to maneuver, played the move h5. Instead of that, if he played some move like knight h4, the position would remain quite balanced. But he played h5, and here is what he underestimated, in my opinion, the change of the pawn structure. Now we get a different pawn structure. We get the isolated queen's pawn, which got a really bad rep for some reason. I will talk about this a little bit later. I think this pawn structure is better than most people think it is. And maybe my opponent just thought that, okay, this is a fine pawn structure for him. If he just puts his pieces on good squares, things will be fine. But now we see that the queen doesn't have that many good squares, and if it goes to the e file, there is another dynamic move, rook e1, and white has a slight initiative here. Now, with some precise moves, black probably can equalize. But for example, it's not that easy to find a good move, because if he moves his bishop to c7, there is a really annoying move d5. And I'm opening up this diagonal, so I can attack the king with queen c3 and knight f6. Maybe rook a to a8 is the best move to improve the rook, not fearing any knight jumps, but he played bishop e7 to control the f6 square. But he forgot about another idea, which is that after knight g3 tempo, he cannot take with the queen on f5, because e7 is hanging. And now the position just falls apart for black, because white has created too many weaknesses on the king side, and this rook on a7 is completely out of the game. And so after just a few moves, white won a pawn and he won the game. So basically the game was over within 5 or 10 moves from the starting position, because I think my opponent misjudged or underestimated some dynamic factors in this central pawn structure with the isolated queen's pawn. There are some other common misconceptions about central pawn structures. For example, there is overestimation of okay, let me give you one more example for the isolated queen's pawn. So underestimation of isolated queen's pawn, or overestimation of the positions where you play against them. So this is one game of my student where he was white, his opponent took on d4. Okay, it's normal exchange, and here white has a choice, to take back or take on d5. And it's basically a strategic choice. Would you like to play the isolated queen's pawn with white, or would you like to play it against it? And most people, they think that playing against the isolated queen's pawn is always good. But it's not really the case, I think, because, for example, in this position, with the exchange on d5, we are opening up black's light squared bishop. And why would we do that? The alternative is like this, where the bishop is still quite passive on c8. We do have the isolated queen's pawn, but we get the c3 square for our knight, and we get the rapid development, and maybe we can push this pawn to d5. You see that in this structure the queen on f6 is misplaced. It usually doesn't belong there. And for example, after some normal moves like this, black can hardly develop. If he plays bishop d7, I have this d5 break, and everything falls apart for him. Or if he plays rook d8, then we can change the pawn structure a little bit, and we have some outposts for our knights like c5 and e5. There is a backward pawn on c6, and then the bishop on c8 is still a bad piece. Now compare this to this position, where we got the position when we play against the isolated queen's pawn, but black gets an easy development. He activates his bishops. Now f2 is also a weakness. And something like this looks very good to me for black, because he has a bishop pair and white will not be able to really take advantage of this weak pawn, even if he puts the knight on d4, which also looks very difficult. Black can go bishop g4 and rook e8 and so on. So one takeaway from this is that you have to assess the positions with isolated queen's pawn very concretely. It's not that it's always good to play against it. The second thing is that sometimes people overestimate the classical pawn center. So this is the pawn center where we actually put two pawns here in the center. And it's a mobile type of pawn center, which has a lot of potential for white. But for example, here there is a very hyper-modern idea, the move bishop e6, provoking white into playing d5, which I think is not such a good move here, but it's been played a lot. And then basically white has a fantastic center, but what is black's idea here? He wants to undermine the center. This is the hyper-modernist idea. Undermine it, destroy it, And here we have one game by Grandmaster Shankland with black, where he allowed white to push the pawn all the way to d6. So is this pawn weak or strong? Well, the course of the game showed that it's not so strong. We just have to mention that queen d6 is not possible. So Shankland played knight d7, and he just completed his development. The important thing is that the pawn is blocked. It cannot move forward. He completed his development, he had strong bishops, and later on he won the game. It was a game against Ishkanov in 2014. Okay, we don't have to go into it too much, but he managed to get his knight to d5 and to take the pawn on d6. So it's not always like that your strong pawn center guarantees you an advantage. It always depends on some dynamic factors as well. And then I want to show one game of Richard Reti. So this is the Reti opening, played by the man himself. And this is another misconception that you have to put the pawns in the center to get an advantage. Not really. As you can see from Reti's game, he didn't put any of his central pawns on d4 or e4. So he just kept on attacking the center from the second rank, with his bishops, and you will later see with other pieces. So black has a really nice pawn center, but what can he do without it? If he pushes any of the pawns, it opens up the diagonal and it gives squares to white knights. And this is the famous maneuver of Reti from this game that was played against Frederick Yates in 1924. This queen a1. And at some point, he made this really nice knight maneuver to e3. See, he's just tempting black to push one of the pawns so that he can create some weaknesses. The position is objectively equal, but just the approach itself, it's very interesting. And h6 was a big mistake. Black lost the sense of danger, because d4 is a really strong move. And now, only now, when white has put the pawn in the center, is it possible to define the central pawn structure. It's either going to be the closed center with e4, or if he takes on d4, it's going to be the isolated queen's pawn, but a really good version for white in this case. Yates decided to play e4 to close the center, but after knight e5, it's really he must make this exchange, and after f4, white got a clear advantage, and he won the game after 10 more moves. So openings like Reti and Alekhine defense and so on, they're playable. I mean, you can tempt your opponent into pushing the pawns, and you can attack the center. Just wait, like a hashrock as well. Just waiting for your opponent to make a weakness in the center. And then there is another misconception about closed positions. So here we have a position from the King's Indian defense, and this misconception often comes from work with the chess engine. So these are the positions which chess engines generally assess as clearly better for white. And in this particular one, which is actually a theoretical position from Mar del Plata variation, the engine initially gives over +1, I think, for white, which would give like an advantage of 1 pawn. His idea is that there are a lot of chronic weaknesses like d6 and b6, and c6 square is weak. But it turns out that black can cover all of these weaknesses. And in practice, black has even scored better than white from this position. So this is just one example where black's counterplay on the king side was quite strong. It's the game between Grandmasters Postny and Macro. So after some exchanges here, we got into a position where white has not really achieved anything on the queen side so far, but black, with this thematic pawn sacrifice, has opened up some squares for his knights, and he got an initiative on the king side, and eventually he did win the game. So it goes to show that you should also take these evaluations by the engine where there is a space advantage with the grain of salt, because it's not always like that. In a practical game, space could be a relative thing. More important factors, position factors, could be king's safety, outposts, and things like that. Okay, and in the next chapter, we will already start looking at basic central pawn structures. We will go, of course, by this classification that we have these 5 major pawn structures, and we will, as I said, cover around 30 basic central pawn structures.